The wind was a blade against Alara's cheek, honed on 1,000 miles of barren, frost-hardened prairie. It found every frayed seam in her worn coat, every gap in the thin wool of the blanket she had wrapped around her brother, Ben. Each gust was a fresh betrayal, stealing the last vestiges of warmth from their bodies and replacing it with a cold so deep it felt like a presence, a living thing that sought to crawl inside their bones and still their hearts. The world had been reduced to this singular, biting reality. There was only the wind, the iron-hard ground beneath her failing legs, and the crushing weight of the twilight that bled across the vast, indifferent sky, draining the last of the day's weak color and leaving behind a bruised purple that promised a night of impossible cold. Ben stirred against her, a small, fretful sound muffled by the blanket. His whimper was thin, reedy, like the cry of a newborn lamb lost in a blizzard. "Alara," he breathed, his voice a ghost of its usual chatter. "I'm hungry." The words were not an accusation, but they struck her with the force of one. She had nothing left. The last of the hardtack had been gone since yesterday's dawn, a miserable, dusty biscuit split between them that had only sharpened the ache in their bellies. Her own hunger was a dull, constant throb, a hollow space she had learned to wall off and ignore. But Ben's hunger was a fire she could not extinguish, a pain that consumed her own. He was only 6. The world, for him, should have been morning chores and the smell of his mother's baking, not this endless, gray emptiness. "I know, Benny. I know," she whispered, her own voice rough with thirst and disuse. She pulled the blanket tighter around him, a useless gesture against the encroaching frost. "We'll find somewhere soon. We just need to keep walking." But her legs felt like waterlogged timber, heavy and unresponsive. For 2 days they had walked, since the wagon had broken its axle and their pa had gone for help, promising to return by nightfall. That was 3 nights ago. The first night, she had kept a fire going, singing songs to Ben to keep the fear at bay, her eyes straining into the darkness for the sight of Pa's lantern. The second night, the hope had begun to curdle into a cold dread that was sharper than the wind. By the third, she knew. She knew with the certainty of an animal that senses the coming of a hard winter. He was not coming back. They were alone. The realization had settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, devastating finality, leaving her hollowed out, an empty vessel filled only with the duty of keeping her brother alive. She scanned the horizon, a desperate, sweeping gaze that took in nothing but the endless, rolling expanse of dun-colored grass, now silvered with frost under the rising moon. The land was immense, a crushing testament to their own insignificance. It stretched on forever, devoid of shelter, devoid of life, devoid of mercy. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, freezing almost instantly on her lashes. She would not cry. Crying was a luxury, a waste of precious energy she no longer possessed. Strength was all that mattered now. It was a litany she repeated in the silent chambers of her mind. "Be strong for him. Be strong." Ben coughed, a dry, racking sound that shook his small frame. He was getting sick. The cold was seeping into his lungs, and she had nothing to fight it with. No medicine, no warmth, no food to fuel his small body's fight. Despair, a thick, suffocating tide, rose in her throat. It was so easy to simply stop, to lie down in the brittle grass and let the cold take them, to let the world fade into a peaceful, painless white. The thought was a seductive whisper, a promise of release from this waking nightmare. She shook her head, a violent, angry motion. No, she would not surrender him to this desolate land. She would carry him on her back until her spine snapped. She would crawl on hands and knees, tearing them raw on the frozen earth, before she would let him go. He was all she had left of home, of a life that now seemed like a half-remembered dream. Her gaze swept the horizon one last time, a prayer without words. And then she saw it. So faint, so distant. It was less a light and more a flaw in the fabric of the darkness. A tiny, intermittent flicker, like a firefly caught in a jar miles away. It could be anything. A star low on the horizon. A trick of her tired eyes. a phantom born of desperation. But it was something. It was a direction. It was a possibility other than the slow, freezing death that stalked them. Hope, she discovered, was a painful thing. It hurt more than the hunger, more than the cold. It was a shard of glass in her heart, because it had the power to be shattered, leaving a wound far deeper than the dull ache of resignation. Yet, she could not ignore it. "Look, Benny," she said, her voice cracking as she pointed with a numb finger. "Do you see? A light." He pushed his face out from the blanket, his eyes wide and dark in his pale face. He squinted, and for a moment, she was terrified he would see nothing, that she had imagined it all. But then he nodded, a slow, weak movement. "A campfire?" he whispered, the word full of a child's simple faith in the goodness of strangers, in the promise of a warm fire. "Maybe," she said, not daring to promise more. "Let's go see." She shifted his weight, piggybacking him as she had for the last several hours. His small arms wrapped around her neck, his cold cheek pressed against her own. He felt impossibly light, as if he were already beginning to fade. Straightening up, Ilara fixed her eyes on the distant flicker. It became her entire world. The wind, the cold, the ache in her limbs. They all receded, becoming a muted backdrop to the singular, desperate purpose that now propelled her forward. Each step was an act of faith. Each breath was a prayer. She did not know if they were walking toward salvation or a crueler, more final deception, but they were walking. And for now, that was enough. The prairie was vast, and the night was deep, but for the first time in days, they were not simply wandering. They were walking toward a light. The journey towards a flicker was a torment measured in agonizingly slow yards. The light never seemed to get closer, a cruel star that retreated with every step she took. The terrain, which had looked flat from a distance, revealed itself to be a treacherous landscape of shallow gullies and ankle-twisting clumps of frozen bunchgrass. Twice, her legs gave out from under her, and she fell to her knees with a jarring impact that sent a shock of pain through her body. Ben's weight was a deadening anchor, his shallow breaths puffing against her neck a constant, terrifying reminder of the dwindling time they had left. The world narrowed to the singular focus of placing one foot in front of the other, a rhythm of pure mechanical will. Her mind, hollowed by exhaustion, latched onto the image of the light, replaying it over and over, a talisman against the encroaching darkness in her own thoughts. She had lost all track of time when the ground began to change. The open prairie gave way to a sparse scattering of skeletal cottonwoods, and then a thicker stand of pine, their dark shapes looming against the star-dusted sky like silent sentinels. The wind lessened amongst the trees, its mournful howl softening to a whisper through the needles. The air grew still and heavy with the scent of pine and cold earth. The light was closer now, no longer a flicker but a steady, golden glow that filtered through the dense trunks ahead. It was real. The realization sent a dizzying wave of relief through her, so potent it almost buckled her knees for a final time. With the last of her strength, she pushed through a thicket of tangled undergrowth and stumbled into a small clearing. There, nestled against a low rise of rock, was a cabin. It was a crude, solitary structure of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, a dark, solid shape against the snow-dusted ground. A plume of smoke curled from a stone chimney, a fragile ribbon against the immense, cold sky. The light she had followed for what felt like an eternity spilled from a single window, a warm, yellow square that promised a world of impossible comfort. It was a haven carved from the heart of the wilderness, but it was also the home of a stranger. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. The kind of man who lived this far from everything, this deep in the unforgiving wilderness, was not a man who courted company. He could be a trapper, a prospector, a man running from the law, or a man who had simply lost his mind to the solitude. He could be kind, or he could be a monster. There was no way to know. The hope that had driven her here now curdled with a new, more immediate terror. They had escaped the slow death of the cold only to potentially deliver themselves into the hands of a much quicker one. Ben whimpered behind her, his body shivering violently. She felt the tremors rack his small frame, and the choice was made for her. They could not turn back. The night would claim them before they had gone 100 yards. Whatever lay behind that door, it was their only chance. She slid Ben gently from her back, settling him on his unsteady feet. He leaned against her, his face pale and pinched in the moonlight. "Stay right here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't make a sound." Taking a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic hammering of her heart, Elara approached the cabin. Each step on the creaking, frost-covered porch boards felt like a drumbeat announcing their intrusion. The door was solid plank wood, weathered and gray, with a simple leather thong for a latch. She raised a trembling hand, hesitating for a long moment before knocking. The sound was shockingly loud in the profound silence of the woods. For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sound was the sighing of the wind in the pines and the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. She was about to knock again, a frantic, desperate rap, when the sound of a heavy bar being lifted from inside echoed through the wood. The door creaked open a few inches, and a sliver of warm, firelit air washed over her, smelling of wood smoke, coffee, and something savory, like roasting meat. The aroma was so overwhelming, so evocative of a life she had lost, that it made her dizzy. A man's shape filled the narrow opening, a tall, broad silhouette against the firelight within. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, sharp and assessing. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick with suspicion and her own unspoken plea. "Please," she finally managed to choke out, the words scraping her raw throat. "My brother, he's sick. We're lost. We saw your light." The man remained motionless, a figure carved from the surrounding darkness. She could not read his expression, could not guess at his thoughts. He was a wall of silence, an unknown quantity that held their lives in his hands. He could slam the door, leaving them to the mercy of the night, and no one in the world would ever know. The vulnerability of their position was absolute. All she could do was stand there, shivering, and wait for his judgment. Finally, he moved. He stepped back, pulling the door wider. It was not a welcome, not an invitation, but a simple, unadorned concession. And he said, his voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together, a sound that seemed to come from the deep earth itself. Elara turned and hurried back to Ben, scooping him up in her arms. He felt terrifyingly light. She carried him across the threshold, moving from the biting, hostile cold into the cocoon of warmth. The sudden change was a physical shock. The heat soaked into her frozen skin, making her limbs tingle with a painful intensity. The small, one-room cabin was stark and simple. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a healthy fire crackling within, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood in the center. A bed piled with furs occupied a corner, and shelves holding tins and supplies lined another wall. It was the space of a man who lived a solitary, functional life. The man closed the door behind them, shutting out the night. The heavy bar slid back into place with a solid, definitive thud. The sound echoed in the small space, a sound of finality. They were sealed inside. Whether it was a sanctuary or a trap, she still did not know. He turned to face them, and for the first time, she saw him clearly in the firelight. He was older than her pa, his face weathered and creased by sun and wind, framed by dark, unkempt hair and a thick beard threaded with gray. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, startling gray, the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. They took in her ragged clothes, Ben's pale face, the desperation that clung to her like a shroud. He looked at them not with pity, but with a flat, unreadable assessment. He was the wilderness made manifest, harsh, unforgiving, and utterly without sentiment. And they were now entirely at his mercy. He gestured with his chin toward the fire. "Put the boy there," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Elara obeyed without a word, her movements stiff and clumsy with cold and fear. She settled Ben on the worn bearskin rug before the hearth, unwrapping the damp, thin blanket from around him. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and rapid. She touched his forehead. It was burning with fever. A fresh wave of panic washed over her. The man watched them for a moment longer before turning away. He moved to a small pot simmering over the fire, the source of the savory smell that had so tormented her outside. He ladled a thick, steaming stew into 2 wooden bowls. He set one on the floor beside her, then the other. He said nothing, did not look at her, but the action was clear. Eat. He then moved to the far side of the cabin, busying himself with mending a leather strap, his back to them, affording them a small, deliberate pocket of privacy. Alara stared at the bowl. The steam rose, carrying the scent of rabbit and wild roots. Her stomach clenched with a hunger so fierce it was a physical pain. But she could not eat. Not yet. She first dipped her fingers in the stew, waiting for it to cool just enough, and brought them to Ben's lips. He stirred, his mouth opening instinctively. She fed him tiny, careful morsels of the tender meat and softened vegetables, watching him swallow with a painful slowness. He managed only a few bites before his eyes fluttered shut again, his small body succumbing to exhaustion and fever. Only then did Alara pick up her own bowl. Her hand shook so badly she could barely hold the spoon. She brought it to her lips, and the first taste of warm, nourishing food was so overwhelming, so intensely good, that she had to close her eyes against the sudden sting of tears. It was more than just food, it was life. It was a reprieve from the precipice on which they had been shivering. She ate slowly, deliberately, forcing herself not to devour it like a starved wolf. Each spoonful was a small anchor, grounding her back in the world of the living. Across the room, the man worked in silence. He did not speak, did not look at them, but she was intensely aware of his presence. He was a silent, brooding fixture in this small haven he had carved for himself. He had given them shelter. He had given them food. But he had not given them a single word of comfort or reassurance. The air remained thick with an unspoken tension, a fragile truce between desperation and suspicion. She did not know his name, nor he hers. They were 3 strangers bound together by a snowstorm and a flickering light, their histories and intentions shrouded in shadow. As she finished the last of the stew, scraping the bowl clean, she knew that survival was more than just a warm fire and a full belly. It was navigating the will of the silent, watchful man who now controlled their fate. The wilderness outside had been a simple, honest threat. The danger in here, if there was any, would be far more complicated. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun and the needs of the man whose name she still did not know. He rose before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards the first sound she would hear. He would stoke the fire, put coffee on to boil, and then disappear into the pre-dawn grayness, a rifle slung over his shoulder. He would return hours later, sometimes with a rabbit or a pair of grouse, which he would skin and clean with an efficient, detached precision that made Alara's stomach turn, even as she knew it was their sustenance. He never spoke of where he went or what he did. He simply provided. Alara's world shrank to the confines of the small cabin and the immediate needs of her brother. Ben's fever clung to him stubbornly, rising in the evenings and leaving him weak and listless during the day. She spent her hours bathing his face with cool water, coaxing sips of broth between his lips, and murmuring stories from their past, trying to anchor him to a world of warmth and safety that felt a million miles away. She was a constant, vigilant presence by his side, her fear a low hum beneath the surface of her quiet care. The man, Silas, she had heard him mutter the name to himself, once while wrestling with a stubborn knot, moved around them as if they were pieces of furniture he had begrudgingly taken in. He did not ignore them, precisely, but he did not engage them either. His presence was a constant, heavy weight in the small room. He ate his meals at the rough table, his back to the fire where she and Ben huddled. He cleaned his rifle, mended his gear, and stared into the flames for long stretches, his thoughts a locked and bolted chamber. His silence was a language all its own, and Alara found herself learning to read it. She learned the subtle shift in his shoulders that meant he was weary, the slight tightening of his jaw that spoke of a coming storm long before the sky darkened. She learned that he left a portion of his own meal on the hearth for her without comment, that he made sure the wood box was always full before he turned in for the night. These were not acts of kindness, she told herself. They were acts of practicality. He was a man accustomed to surviving, and he was treating them as he would any stray animal that had wandered into his territory, feeding it to keep it from becoming a problem, sheltering it until it was strong enough to move on. Still, a tentative trust began to form, not from words but from this shared, silent routine. He had not harmed them. He had not asked for anything in return. He had simply allowed them to exist in the quiet orbit of his solitary life. Alara, in turn, tried to make them less of a burden. When Ben slept, she would sweep the hearth, fold the spare blankets, and wash their bowls in the bucket of melted snow he brought in each morning. She found a needle and thread in a small wooden box and meticulously mended the tear in Ben's trousers and the frayed cuff of the man's spare shirt. They were small gestures, offerings of utility in a world where sentiment had no currency. He never acknowledged her work, but she would see him glance at the neat pile of folded blankets or run his thumb over the tidy stitches on his cuff. And in his silence, she read a flicker of something. Not approval, perhaps, but a grudging acceptance. One afternoon, as a pale sun filtered through the cabin's single, greasy pane of glass, she sat watching Ben sleep. He was so still, his face flushed with fever, his breath a faint whisper. A wave of despair, sharp and sudden, washed over her. He wasn't getting better. The warmth and food were not enough. He was fading before her eyes, and she was helpless to stop it. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She hastily wiped it away, but not before Silas, who had been sharpening a skinning knife by the window, saw it. He stopped his work, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone falling silent. The sudden quiet made her look up. He was watching her, his pale gray eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch. For the first time, his gaze was not flat or assessing, but something else, something deeper. He rose and walked to a dark corner of the cabin, rummaging through a wooden crate. He returned with a small, dusty leather pouch. He knelt beside her, the unexpected proximity making her flinch. He ignored her reaction, his focus entirely on the pouch. He opened it, and the sharp, herbal scent of dried leaves and roots filled the air. "Willow bark," he said, his voice a low rumble. "For the fever." And yarrow. To make him sweat it out, he measured a small amount of the crushed bark and dried flowers into a tin cup, added water from the kettle hanging over the fire, and stirred it with the tip of his knife. The resulting brew was dark and bitter-smelling. He held the cup out to her. Make him drink it. It was not a suggestion. It was an order, but it was the first time he had spoken to her directly about Ben's welfare, the first time he had offered a solution instead of just silent provision. She took the cup, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough and calloused, but there was a surprising warmth to his skin. She gently woke Ben, propping his head on her lap. "Benny, you need to drink this," she urged softly. "It will make you feel better." He turned his head away, whimpering at the bitter smell. "No, tastes bad. Please, Ben," she begged, her voice tight with desperation. Silas let out a sigh, a sound of gruff impatience. He knelt on Ben's other side. "Boy," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, though still firm. "This is not a request. In this cabin, we do what is necessary to survive. This is necessary." He took the cup from Alara, and with a practiced, steady hand, he tipped a small amount of the liquid into the corner of Ben's mouth, forcing him to swallow. Ben coughed and sputtered, but he swallowed. Silas repeated the process, patient and implacable, until the cup was empty. Then he rose and returned to his side of the room as if nothing had happened, picking up his knife and stone. But something had shifted. It was a small thing, a shared moment of purpose over her brother's sick form, but it felt monumental. He had crossed the invisible line that separated them, had entered her sphere of fear and worry, and offered not comfort, but competence. And in that moment, Alara felt a flicker of something more than just tentative trust. It was a fragile, budding sprout of gratitude, a recognition that this harsh, silent man might be the only reason her brother had a chance at all. The cabin was still a cage, but its bars were beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a protective shield. The night after Silas administered the herbal remedy was the worst yet. Ben's fever spiked, just as the yarrow was meant to make it do. He thrashed on the bearskin rug, his small body slick with a sweat that seemed to steam in the cool cabin air. He cried out in his sleep, murmuring names Alara didn't recognize, lost in a delirious world she couldn't enter. She knelt beside him, wiping his brow with a damp cloth, her heart a cold, tight knot of fear in her chest. Every pained whimper, every shudder that racked his frame, was a physical blow to her. The remedy felt like a cruel trick, a poison that was pushing him closer to the edge instead of pulling him back. Through it all, Silas sat at his table, watching. He did not interfere, did not offer words of hollow comfort. He simply watched, his face an unreadable mask in the flickering firelight, his presence a heavy, silent anchor in the room. Alara was acutely aware of his gaze, but she was too consumed by Ben's struggle to care. The storm had to break. It had to. Sometime in the deep, silent hours before dawn, it did. The frantic tossing subsided, replaced by a deep, shuddering sigh. Ben's breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, evened out, deepening into the rhythm of true sleep. The violent heat radiating from his skin lessened, leaving him soaked but blessedly cool to the touch. The fever had broken. Alara's own body sagged with a relief so profound it left her weak and trembling. She slumped against the stone hearth, her head bowed, and finally let the tears she had held back for so long fall. They were silent, exhausted tears, not of grief, but of a desperate, bone-deep gratitude. The crisis had passed. He was going to be all right. When she finally looked up, her vision blurry, Silas was standing over her. He held out a tin cup. "Drink," he said. It was coffee, black and strong. She took it with numb fingers, the warmth seeping into her frozen hands. He didn't return to his table. Instead, he crouched down by the fire, adding a fresh log with a quiet thud. He stared into the flames, his profile stark and severe. "He will be weak for a few days," Silas said, his voice low, not looking at her. "But the worst is over." "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. "I thought," she trailed off, unable to voice the terrible fear that had gripped her. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The mountain is a harsh physician. It either cures you or it kills you. There is little in between." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and Ben's steady breathing. The shared vigil had forged a new kind of understanding between them, an intimacy born not of conversation, but of a shared, desperate fight against the encroaching darkness. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, her fear laid bare, and had not turned away. He had met her desperation with his quiet competence. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the window, painting the cabin in shades of gray and silver, a new storm rolled in from the north. The wind began to howl, rattling the wooden shutters and driving pellets of snow against the glass. The world outside disappeared into a swirling vortex of white. They were trapped, but for the first time, the thought of being sealed inside the cabin with this man did not fill Alara with dread. The storm outside was a raging, impersonal fury, but inside, there was the steady warmth of the fire, the quiet presence of the man who had saved her brother, and the precious, peaceful sound of Ben's sleeping breath. The blizzard raged for 3 days, entombing them in a world of white. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and snow piled in great drifts against the door and window, plunging the cabin into a perpetual twilight. The world outside ceased to exist. Their universe was the fire, the log walls, and the 3 of them inside. The forced confinement shifted the dynamic within the cabin yet again. The silence, once heavy with suspicion, became more comfortable, companionable even. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but wait out the storm's fury. Ben recovered quickly. The day after his fever broke, he woke with clear eyes and a ferocious appetite. He was still weak, but his natural childish energy began to reassert itself. He watched Silas with wide, curious eyes, no longer afraid of the big, quiet man. He would ask questions in his small, piping voice, questions that Alara would have never dared to ask. "Why is your beard so scratchy?" he asked one afternoon, as Silas sat cleaning his rifle. Alara tensed, expecting a gruff dismissal. But Silas paused, looking at the boy. A long moment passed. "Keeps my face from freezing off," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. Ben seemed to consider this. "Pa had a beard," he offered, "but it was brown." Silas said nothing, but he didn't turn away. He simply went back to his work, a silent acknowledgement of the boy's statement. These small interactions became a bridge between them. Ben, with his innocent fearlessness, was able to breach the walls of Silas's solitude in a way Alara, with her cautious gratitude, could not. With Ben stronger, Alara felt a restless need to contribute, to earn their keep in a more tangible way. She could not hunt or chop wood like Silas, but she could make their small space more of a home. She took down the dusty tins from his shelves, wiped them clean, and arranged them in neat rows. She used a precious sliver of soap she found in her pocket to wash their clothes in a bucket of melted snow, hanging them near the fire to dry. She learned the rhythms of his cooking, anticipating when he would need the salt tin or the cast iron skillet, having it ready for him without a word being exchanged. One morning, she found a sack of flour tucked away in a crate. While Silas was outside, checking his snares in a brief lull in the storm, she mixed a simple dough with water and salt. Her mother had taught her how to make flatbreads, cooking them on a hot stone by the fire. Her first few attempts were charred and misshapen, but she persisted, her hands remembering the familiar motions of kneading and shaping. By the time Silas returned, his eyebrows and beard caked with snow, a small stack of imperfect but edible flatbreads sat on the table. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes going from the bread to her, a flicker of surprise in their gray depths. He took off his heavy coat, shook the snow from it, and walked to the table. He picked up a piece of the bread, broke it in half, and chewed it thoughtfully. He didn't say, "This is good," or "Thank you." He simply looked at her and said, "There's a bag of dried apples in the corner." They softened well in the dough. It was the highest praise he could have offered. It was an invitation. It was an acknowledgement that she was no longer just a refugee he was sheltering, but a participant in their shared existence. From that day on, she took over the cooking. It was a small domain, but it was hers. She learned to make a passable stew from the game he brought in, to stretch their meager supplies, to create a semblance of a proper meal from the barest of ingredients. The act of providing nourishment, of turning his raw provisions into a warm meal, gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her world had fallen apart. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a contributor. She began to notice the small details of his life, the clues to the man he was. A single, well-worn book tucked on a high shelf. She couldn't read the title, but the pages were soft with use. A small, intricately carved wooden bird that sat on the mantelpiece. Its form so delicate it seemed impossible it could have been made by his large, calloused hands. These objects spoke of a life before this harsh solitude, a life with softness and learning. They hinted at a depth to him that his gruff exterior belied. He, in turn, began to observe her. She would feel his eyes on her as she carefully stitched a patch on a Ben's knee or told her brother a quiet story by the fire. His gaze was no longer just assessing. It held a new quality, a quiet respect. He saw her resilience, her fierce devotion to her brother, her refusal to be broken by circumstance. They were two solitary, wounded creatures who had been thrown together by a storm. In the confines of a small cabin, they were slowly, cautiously, learning to see each other. The trust between them was no longer just a matter of necessity. It was becoming a quiet, unspoken bond, forged in shared silence and the common goal of seeing the sun rise on another day. The blizzard finally broke on the fourth morning, leaving behind a world transformed. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the sun, when it crested the ridge, struck dazzling fire from a landscape buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow. The silence was absolute, profound. When Silas opened the cabin door, he had to push hard against a deep drift, and the light that flooded the small space was so bright it made them all blink. The beauty of it was sharp, almost painful. It was a clean slate, a world washed new. But Alara knew the beauty was deceptive. The snow that looked so soft and gentle was a trap. It hid the familiar landmarks, made travel impossible, and promised a swift, freezing death to anyone caught unprepared. The cabin, which had felt like a prison during the storm, now seemed like the only safe place in the entire world. That afternoon, while Ben napped and Silas was outside clearing a path, Alara heard the sound of dogs. It was distant at first, a faint, frantic yapping that was nearly swallowed by the vast silence. But it grew steadily closer. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thump against her ribs. No one came this way. Silas's isolation was absolute. The sound of dogs meant people, and people, in her experience, meant trouble. She went to the window, rubbing a clear patch on the frosted pane. Far down the shallow valley, she saw them. 3 figures on horseback, dark shapes against the blinding white of the snow, their forms distorted by the shimmering air. A small pack of hounds ran ahead of them, their noses to the ground. Silas came in moments later, his face grim. He had heard them too. He moved with a sudden, tense urgency that she had never seen before. He didn't look at her, but spoke in a low, clipped voice. "Get the boy. Go to the root cellar. The trapdoor is under the bed. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do not come out until I come for you. Do you understand?" The command was so sharp, so absolute, that fear, cold and immediate, seized her. "Who are they?" she whispered. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs on the wall and checked the load. "Men who believe this land belongs to them. They believe everything under it does, too." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were like chips of ice. "They are not here for a friendly visit. Now, go." There was no time to question, no time to think. She scooped up a sleeping Ben, wrapping him in a heavy fur blanket. He stirred, murmuring a protest, but didn't wake. She hurried to the bed in the corner, a crude frame of pine logs. As Silas had said, beneath the mattress of pine boughs and furs, there was a heavy wooden trapdoor with a leather pull. She heaved it open, revealing a dark, square hole that smelled of damp earth and potatoes. She lowered Ben into the darkness first, settling him gently on the packed dirt floor. Then she climbed down after him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The cellar was small and cold, barely tall enough for her to stand upright. Silas's voice came from above, a low rumble. "Pull the door down. Don't latch it." She reached up and pulled the heavy door down, plunging them into near-total darkness. A thin sliver of light from the cabin above outlined the edges of the door. She could hear the muffled sounds of Silas moving above them, the scrape of the table being moved, the solid thud of the bar falling across the door. Then silence. She huddled in the cold dark, clutching Ben to her. He was starting to wake up, confused and frightened by the sudden darkness. "Shoo, Benny, it's all right," she whispered against his hair, her own voice trembling. "It's a game. We have to be very, very quiet." The sound of the dogs grew louder, a frenzy of barking right outside the cabin walls. Then came the sound of men's voices, rough and loud, followed by a heavy, authoritative pounding on the door. "Silas, we know you're in there, you old goat. The snow's melted enough for us to see the smoke from your chimney clear from the ridge. Open up." Alara held her breath, her entire body rigid. She could hear the creak of the floorboards above as Silas moved. What was he doing? What would he say? The voice from outside came again, laced with impatience and menace. "Don't make us kick it down, old man. We just want to talk. A conversation about what you've been digging up on our claim." A claim. These are the prospectors Silas had mentioned. The men who believed the mountain and everything in it belonged to them. A deep, primal fear settled in Alara's gut. These were not men who would be reasoned with. They were men who took what they wanted. She and Ben were not just witnesses now. They were liabilities. If they were found, What would these men do to them? Her arms tightened around her brother, a fierce, protective gesture. Down here in the cold, silent earth, she finally understood the truth of Silas's isolation. It wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity. His solitude was a shield, and they had just become the weakness in his armor. The world had found them again, and it had come with dogs and angry men. The silence from within the cabin stretched on, a tense, defiant answer to the demands from outside. Alara could picture Silas standing in the middle of the room, rifle in hand, a silent, immovable object against the forces gathering at his door. The man outside, his patience clearly exhausted, shouted again, "Fine, have it your way, you stubborn old fool." There was a splintering crash as a heavy boot slammed against the door. Another followed, and another, the impacts shaking the entire cabin. Dust and dirt sifted down from the floorboards above, raining on Alara and Ben in the darkness. Ben started to cry, a muffled, terrified sound against her shoulder. She pressed his face in her coat, whispering frantic reassurances, her own heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Above them, the door finally gave way with a rending groan of tortured wood. Heavy footsteps stomped into the cabin. There were 3 of them by the sound of it. Well, look what we have here," a voice drawled, dripping with contempt. "Sitting in the dark like a mole in its hole. You're not very hospitable, Silas." There was no response from Silas. Alara strained her ears, trying to place him in the room, trying to imagine the scene unfolding just a few feet above her head. "We'll get right to it," the first voice continued. His name was likely Corrigan, the leader. "My partners and I, we've been watching you. Seen you coming back from up the creek, your pouches looking heavy. We staked this whole valley last spring. Anything you pull out of that ground belongs to us. We're here to collect our property. And for the inconvenience, we'll be taking your rifle and supplies as well. You can have the pleasure of walking out." The threat was clear. They intended to leave him to die, to strip him of everything and abandon him to the merciless winter. It was a death sentence. Still, Silas said nothing. His silence was more powerful, more unnerving than any shouted defiance. It was the silence of a man who was not afraid, a man who had already weighed his options and made his choice. "Not much of a talker, are you?" another man sneered. "Maybe we should help you find your voice." There was a scuffling sound, the scrape of a stool being kicked over. Then, finally, Silas spoke. His voice was dangerously calm, a low rumble that seemed to make the very air in the cellar vibrate. "You made 2 mistakes. The first was thinking anything on this mountain belongs to you. The second was breaking down my door." The next sound was the deafening, explosive roar of the rifle firing inside the enclosed space of the cabin. The blast was so loud it felt like a physical blow. Ben screamed, a raw, piercing cry of terror that he could no longer suppress. Alara clapped a hand over his mouth, her own body shaking uncontrollably. They had heard him. They knew. The sliver of hope she had clung to, that they could remain hidden, vanished. They knew they were not alone. "What the hell was that?" One of the men shouted above the ringing in Alara's ears. "A child. So the old wolf has pups," Corrigan's voice said, a new, cruel amusement in his tone. "Hiding them away, are you? Changes things, doesn't it? Gives us a bit of leverage." A cold dread, worse than anything she had ever felt, washed over Alara. They weren't just liabilities anymore. They were leverage. They were weapons to be used against Silas. She could hear them moving about the cabin now, kicking over crates, searching. They were looking for them. The floorboards creaked directly above their heads. One of the men stomped on the floor, testing the boards. "Where are they, old man?" Corrigan demanded. "In the walls? Under the floor? Tell us, or I swear we'll burn this whole cabin to the ground with you, and them inside it." The threat hung in the dusty air. Alara's mind raced. She looked around the dark cellar, at the earthen walls, at her terrified brother. There was no escape. They were trapped like rats. But the fire of desperation, the same fire that had driven her across the frozen prairie, ignited within her. She would not let them take her brother. She would not be a weapon used against the man who had saved them. She remembered the heavy iron poker that rested by the hearth, the cast iron skillet, anything that could be used as a weapon. But she was down here, and the danger was up there. Her helplessness was absolute. Then, from above, came an unexpected sound. It was the sharp, metallic click of a trap being sprung, followed by a man's scream of pain and surprise. Silas had not been idle in his silence. He had been preparing. The cabin was his territory, his fortress, and these men had just discovered that he knew its secrets far better than they did. The balance of power, for a fleeting, precious moment, had shifted. The scream from above was followed by a string of curses and the sound of a body thrashing on the floor. "My leg! He's trapped my leg!" One of the intruders yelled, his voice tight with agony. "Stay back from the hearth." Silas's voice boomed, sharp and commanding. "The whole floor is rigged." It was a bluff, Ilera realized. A brilliant, desperate bluff. He had likely set one of his bear traps, hidden under a fur rug near the fireplace. But now he was making them believe the entire cabin was a minefield. The heavy, confident footsteps of the other two men faltered. They were hunters and prospectors, men who understood the brutal, bone-snapping power of a steel trap. The thought of stepping on one was enough to freeze them in their tracks. "You're a clever bastard, I'll give you that," Corrigan's voice snarled, but the confident swagger was gone, replaced by a new, wary respect. "But there are still two of us and one of you, and you can't watch us both at once." There was another long, tense silence. Ilera, huddled in the darkness below, tried to piece together the scene. Silas, with his single-shot rifle, now empty. One man caught in a trap, incapacitated. Two others, armed and dangerous, but now hesitant, afraid to move. It was a standoff, a fragile, volatile stalemate that could shatter at any moment. She had to do something. The thought was a frantic, insistent pulse in her mind. Silas had given them a chance, a sliver of an opening. She could not just cower in the cellar and wait for the outcome. She remembered his words, "Do not come out until I come for you." But the situation had changed. Her brother's cry had changed everything. They were no longer hidden. They were part of the fight now, whether she wanted to be or not. Her eyes, now accustomed to the gloom, scanned the small cellar. It was filled with sacks of potatoes, turnips, and crates of winter supplies. In the corner, she saw the dull glint of metal. It was a spare shovel head, its wooden handle broken off near the base. It was heavy, awkward, but it was something. She picked it up, the cold, iron solid, reassuring weight in her trembling hands. "Benny," she whispered, her voice fierce and low. "You have to stay here. Hide behind those sacks, and do not move, do not make a sound. Do you promise me?" His eyes were huge and terrified in the dark, but he nodded, a small, jerky movement. He understood the gravity of the situation, the primal fear that had stripped away his childhood. He scurried into the corner, disappearing behind a stack of potato sacks. Ilera took a deep, steadying breath. She looked up at the trapdoor. It was her only way out, and it would deliver her right into the middle of the confrontation. But if she could create a distraction, even for a second, it might be the second Silas needed. It was a desperate, foolish plan, born of terror and a fierce, burgeoning loyalty to the man who had become their protector. She gripped the shovel head, its sharp edge biting in her palm. She was no longer just a girl running from her fate. She was a girl running toward it. With a silent prayer, she reached up and pushed on the heavy wooden door. The trapdoor lifted with a low groan, opening a square of dim, smoky light into the cellar's darkness. Ilera's head and shoulders emerged into the cabin, and the scene that met her eyes was a tableau of frozen violence. One of the intruders, a lanky man with a pockmarked face, was on the floor near the hearth, his leg caught in the brutal steel jaws of a bear trap, his face pale and slick with sweat. The leader, Corrigan, a big man with a cruel mouth, stood near the center of the room, a pistol in his hand, aimed squarely at Silas. The third man was by the broken door, a rifle held at the ready. Silas stood near the back wall, his own rifle on the floor beside him, clearly empty. He held a long skinning knife in one hand, but he was outmatched and he knew it. His eyes, cold and gray as a winter storm, flickered toward her for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a look of anger that she had disobeyed him, but one of sharp, sudden alarm. He had wanted her safe. Her appearance had just complicated his desperate gambit. "Well, look what crawled out of the dirt," Corrigan sneered, his attention shifting to her. His pistol, however, remained trained on Silas. "Come on out, girl. Bring the little one with you." "Leave her out of this, Corrigan," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "Your business is with me." "Your business became my business when you started hiding things," Corrigan shot back. He gestured with his pistol. "The girl. Out. Now." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her body to obey. She climbed out of the cellar, the heavy shovel head held behind her back, concealed by the folds of her skirt. She stood there, a small, defiant figure in the center of the tense room. "The boy, too," Corrigan insisted. "He's scared," Alara said, her voice shaking but clear. "He won't come out." Corrigan's eyes narrowed. He was losing patience. The man in the trap moaned, a low, guttural sound of pain. The distraction was working, but not in the way she had intended. It was focusing all of the hostility, all of the danger, onto her. She took a slow step to her left, deliberately moving away from the cellar opening and slightly closer to the large cast iron skillet that sat on the cold cook stove. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and calculation. She needed to create a real diversion, something loud, something violent, something that would break the standoff. "What's in the bag, girl?" the third man by the door asked, his eyes sharp. He had noticed the way she was holding her arm, the unnatural stiffness of her posture. Before Corrigan could react, Alara acted. With a cry that was part fear and part rage, she swung the shovel head from behind her back, not at the men, but the precarious stack of tins on the shelves next to her. She put all of her strength, all of her desperation, into the blow. The heavy iron smashed into the tower of tins with a tremendous, deafening crash. Cans of beans, peaches, and salted meat exploded across the room, rolling and clattering across the floorboards. The sudden, violent noise was the catalyst. For a critical second, all eyes, including Corrigan's, jerked toward the source of the chaos. It was the only opening Silas needed. He lunged, not at Corrigan, but at the table. In one fluid motion, he kicked one of its legs, upending the heavy wooden slab. It crashed down directly in the path between him and Corrigan, creating a momentary barricade. At the same instant, the third man by the door, startled by the noise, took a half-step forward, forgetting Silas's warning. His foot came down on a loose floorboard that wasn't loose at all. There was a sharp crack, and a heavy log, weighted with rocks and cunningly balanced in the rafters above, swung down like a pendulum. It caught the man squarely in the chest, sweeping him off his feet and sending him crashing back out the broken doorway into the snow. 2 men were down. Only Corrigan remained. But a second was all it took for him to recover. He fired his pistol, the shot deafening in the small cabin. The bullet splintered the edge of the overturned table, missing Silas by inches. Alara screamed, dropping the shovel head and scrambling back toward the cellar opening. Silas was already moving, vaulting over the table, the skinning knife held low. He was no longer a quiet homesteader. He was a force of pure, primal survival. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was terrifying to behold. Corrigan tried to aim for another shot, but Silas was too close. He slammed into the larger man, and they crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The pistol skittered across the floor, coming to rest near the hearth. Alara saw it. Her mind, which had been frozen with terror, suddenly cleared. She scrambled on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pain of a splintered floorboard digging into her palm. She snatched the gun, its metal still warm. It was heavy, alien in her hand. She had never held a pistol before, let alone fired one. Silas and Corrigan were wrestling on the floor, a desperate, grunting struggle for dominance. Corrigan was bigger and heavier, but Silas was wiry and relentless. He fought like a cornered wolf, using his knowledge of the cabin to his advantage, twisting to avoid a blow, using the legs of an overturned stool for leverage. Alara got to her feet, the pistol held in both shaking hands. She tried to aim it, but the two men were a thrashing, inseparable mass. She couldn't risk hitting Silas. She felt a wave of helpless frustration. She had the weapon, but she was useless. Then she saw her chance. Corrigan, using his superior weight, managed to pin Silas's arms and get on top of him. His hands went to Silas's throat. Silas's face began to darken, his legs kicking uselessly. "Now, you old bastard," Corrigan grunted, his face contorted with effort and hate. "Let's see what the mountain thinks of you now." There was no time to think. Alara raised the pistol, not at the men, but at the ceiling directly above them. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was immense, a physical concussion that threw her back a step. Plaster and dust rained down from the ceiling. The shock of the blast, so close to his head, was enough. Corrigan flinched, his grip on Silas's throat loosening for a single, vital instant. It was all Silas needed. With a great heave, he twisted his body, bucking Corrigan off him. He came up on one knee, gasping for air, the skinning knife still clutched in his hand. Corrigan scrambled backward, his eyes wide with fury and surprise. He saw Alara, standing with the smoking pistol, and his face twisted into a mask of pure venom. He lunged, not for Silas, but for her. He never made it. Silas, moving with the last of his strength, threw the knife. It was not a wild, desperate toss, but a precise, calculated motion. The blade spun end over end, catching the light from the doorway before it buried itself deep in Corrigan's thigh. He screamed a high, thin sound of agony and collapsed to the floor, clutching his leg. The fight was over. Silence descended on the cabin, thick and heavy, broken only by the ragged gasps of Silas, the pained moans of the man in the trap, and Corrigan's hoarse cursing. Alara stood frozen, the heavy pistol dangling from her numb fingers, the acrid smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. She looked at the chaos around her, the overturned furniture, the scattered tins, the 3 injured men. She had done this. She had been a part of this brutal, violent struggle. Silas pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily against the wall. He looked at her, his chest heaving. His eyes were not angry or cold. They held a new, raw emotion she couldn't quite name, a mixture of shock, relief, and a profound, weary respect. He looked at the pistol in her hand, then back at her face. He walked over to her and gently took the gun from her grasp. His fingers were steady as he uncocked the hammer. "You did well," he said, his voice a rough rasp. It was the most direct praise he had ever given her, and it landed with the weight of a benediction. From a cellar opening, a small, pale face appeared. Ben, drawn out by the sudden silence, peered into the room, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. He saw the men on the floor, the blood, the destruction. His gaze found Alara, and he scrambled out, running to her and burying his face in her skirt, his small body trembling. Alara wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close, her own body finally starting to shake with the delayed shock of what had just happened. She looked from her brother's head to Silas, who was now standing guard over the defeated intruders. The 3 of them, a silent man, a frightened girl, and a small boy, had faced the wolves at their door. And they had won. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home they had defended. It was theirs. The aftermath of the confrontation was a grim, methodical affair. Under Silas's watchful eye and the unwavering threat of his reloaded rifle, Alara helped bind the men's hands with strips of leather. The man with the broken leg from the trap was in too much pain to be a threat, and Corrigan, after a single venomous glare at Silas, lapsed into a sullen, hateful silence as she tightly wrapped a bandage around his bleeding thigh. The 3rd man, who had been knocked unconscious by the swinging log, was dragged back inside and tied up with the others. The cabin, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a jail, filled with the hostile presence of their captives. Silas worked with a grim efficiency, his movements economical and precise. He wasted no words, issuing only brief, necessary commands to Alara. More water, hold this tighter. She obeyed without question, her earlier fear replaced by a kind of numb focus. They moved around each other in a practiced, unspoken partnership, a team forged in the crucible of violence. When the men were secured, Silas sent her to fetch water from the creek while he stood guard. The short walk through the snow was a welcome reprieve. The air was bitingly cold and clean, and the silence of the woods was a balm after the chaos in the cabin. The world outside was still beautiful, indifferent to the brutal human drama that had just unfolded. Alara knelt by the creek, the water so cold it burned her hands, and watched her own reflection, a smudged, unfamiliar face looking back at her. She did not recognize the person she had been just a few weeks ago, the desperate, half-starved girl stumbling through the darkness. The girl in the reflection had a new hardness in her eyes, a set to her jaw that hadn't been there before. She had faced down armed men. She had fired a gun. The wilderness, both outside and inside the cabin, had stripped away her girlhood and left a woman in its place, a woman she was only just beginning to know. When she returned, Silas had a fire going again, and the cabin was filled with the smell of strong coffee. Ben was sitting quietly on the bearskin rug, carving a piece of soft pine with a small knife Silas must have given him, his earlier terror forgotten in the intensity of his new task. The three prisoners sat slumped against the wall, a miserable, defeated trio. Silas handed her a cup of coffee. They stood together by the fire, not speaking, watching the flames. The shared silence was different now. It was not the silence of strangers, but the comfortable, resonant silence of two people who had been through a fire together and had come out the other side, changed but intact. "What will you do with them?" she finally asked, her voice low. "When the snow hardens, I will take them to Fort Bridger," he said. "There's a marshal there. He can sort them out." Fort Bridger was a week's journey in good weather. In this cold, it would be a long, dangerous trek. "You'll go alone?" The thought of him leaving, of them being left here, sent a small, sharp pang of anxiety through her. He looked down at her, his gray eyes seeming to see right through her. "They broke the law. There are rules. Even out here," he paused, then added, "You and the boy will be safe here. There is enough food and wood to last until I return." It was a statement of fact, a reassurance. But it felt like more. It was a promise. He was not abandoning them. He was entrusting them with his home, his sanctuary. He was planning to return. The realization settled deep within her, a warm, solid weight. This was not a temporary arrangement anymore. Their lives were now intertwined in a way that could not be easily undone. Over the next 2 days, as they waited for the fresh snow to freeze hard enough to support a sled, a new domesticity settled over the cabin, bizarrely coexisting with the three bound men against the wall. Alara cooked meals, Ben practiced his carving, and Silas prepared for his journey, methodically checking his gear, oiling his rifle, and packing supplies. He showed Alara how to properly load and fire the rifle, his large hands guiding her smaller ones, his instructions patient and clear. "Aim low," he told her as she held the heavy weapon, trying to steady it against her shoulder. "And squeeze the trigger, don't pull it." He made her practice until she could do it with her eyes closed. He was arming her, empowering her, ensuring she could defend herself and her brother in his absence. He was giving her the tools to survive, not just as a guest in his home, but as its guardian. On the morning of his departure, the air was sharp and clear. He had constructed a crude sled on which he would transport Corrigan, whose leg was too injured to walk. The other two would be forced to walk, tethered together. As he made his final preparations, Alara found herself filled with a profound reluctance to see him go. He had become a constant, reassuring presence, a bulwark against the harshness of the world. She had packed him a parcel of food, the flatbreads she had learned to make, and strips of dried venison. She handed it to him as he stood by the door, wrapped in his heavy furs. "For the journey," she said simply. He took it, his gaze holding hers for a long moment. There were 1,000 things left unsaid between them, a whole history of fear and gratitude and respect that had never been voiced. But in that shared look, it was all understood. "The woodpile is high," he said. "The snares are set by the creek. You'll be all right." "I know," she said, and she did. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence she hadn't known she possessed. He knelt down in front of Ben. "You're the man of the cabin now," he said, his voice gruff. "You look after your sister." Ben nodded solemnly, clutching his newly carved wooden bird, a perfect, miniature copy of the one on Silas's mantle. "I will," he promised. Silas placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, a rare gesture of affection. Then he stood, gave one last, sweeping glance around the cabin that was his home, and met Alara's eyes again. He gave a short, sharp nod, turned, and led his prisoners out into the blinding white morning. Alara and Ben stood in the doorway and watched him go. They watched as he and his grim procession became smaller and smaller figures against the vast, snow-covered landscape, until they were finally swallowed by the distance. The silence they left behind was immense, but it was not empty. The cabin was filled with the echoes of the last few weeks, with the memories of fear overcome and strength discovered. She closed the door, the new, repaired bar sliding into place with a satisfying thud. She looked around the small room. It was no longer a stranger's cabin. It was her home. She had bled for it, fought for it. She was not a guest here, waiting for rescue. She was its keeper. She looked at Ben, who was already heading back to the fire to continue his work. She felt a deep, unshakable sense of peace settle over her. The future was still an unknown territory, a vast, uncharted wilderness. But she was no longer lost in it. She had found her place. She had a home, a brother to care for, and the knowledge that the man who had saved them would be coming back. And for the first time in a very long time, that was more than enough. It was everything.